Imagine sitting in your own home. You're just, going about your day, maybe making a cup of coffee, when suddenly a squad of police bursts through your front door.
Oh, man.
Yeah, they seize all your devices, they take you into custody, and you are arrested for a major serious crime. So you're sitting there in this interrogation room trying to figure out what on earth you could have possibly done, and you finally learn your alleged offense, your crime. Clicking retweet a few times over the span of 20 years.
It sounds like a dystopian novel, right?
It really does. But welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a massive stack of AI-generated legal analyses. We've got stuff from ChatGPT, Copilot, DeepSeek, Gemini, Grok, and Quinn. And we're looking at this alongside a really intense case document known as the Prism Blood Letter. We're trying to figure out how a physicist's digital footprint triggered an international human rights debate.
And we should probably pause here just to be totally transparent with you.
Yes, definitely.
The documents we're diving into today involve some highly charged political and judicial systems, specifically regarding the Chinese government and various ideological conflicts.
Yeah.
And we just want to make it absolutely clear that we aren't taking any sides here, not left, not right.
Right.
And we aren't endorsing the views in these documents. Our only goal today is just to look at the raw data, the legal arguments, the complex systems physics, exactly as the AI models and the original texts present them.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. How does a physics scholar's digital footprint turn into an international human rights debate?
Well, to really get into that, we had to start with the baseline that all these AI models use to evaluate the scenario. Across the board, from ChatGPT to Copilot, the models anchored their whole analysis in the ICCPR.
The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Exactly. And the models are very quick to point out that this isn't just some abstract philosophical text. It is a binding international treaty. It essentially acts as the minimum operating system for the global rule of law.
Which makes sense. Governments obviously have to limit certain behaviors to keep society functioning. You can't just have absolute anarchy.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
And the ICCPR totally accounts for that. But it imposes these strict parameters on state power. ChatGPT actually synthesizes these into 3 foundational rules.
Okay, what are they?
So first is legality. Any law that limits a right has to be crystal clear, predictable, and non-arbitrary.
Meaning you have to know what crosses the line before you actually cross it?
Right. No making up rules after the fact. Second is legitimate aim. The restriction must serve a valid, recognized purpose, things like protecting public order or national security.
Sure.
And third, which is the most rigorous hurdle, is necessity and proportionality. The state's response has to be the absolute minimum required to achieve that legitimate aim.
It's essentially like a bouncer at a club.
Oh, how so?
Well, the bouncer has a legitimate aim to keep people safe inside, right? And
Yeah.
they have a clear legal rule about the building's capacity, but they can't use a bazooka to stop someone from cutting the line outside.
That is a very vivid image.
You just can't use a massive destructive weapon to solve a minor administrative problem because that completely violates proportionality.
That is actually a perfect analogy. And the AI models measure that exact proportionality against 3 specific articles of the ICCPR. Article 19, which guarantees freedom of expression. Article 9, which protects citizens from arbitrary arrest and detention. And Article 14, the right to a fair and public hearing by an impartial tribunal.
Got it.
The consensus across the entire AI stack is that these articles are the bedrock for evaluating any state action.
But, abstract treaties are one thing. How a treaty actually holds up when applied to an actual human life is the real test.
Which brings us to the core of our sources today, the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan.
Right.
So Dr. Chen, he was born in 1976. He is a PhD-holding intellectual and an independent scholar. And his specific area of expertise is complex, nonlinear systems.
Which sounds very intense.
It really is. He basically spends his life studying the mathematical architecture of massive, unpredictable networks. Everything from physical matter to social dynamics.
Yet in 2022, he was arrested under a charge known in the Chinese legal system as picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Yeah, and Quinn and Grok both flag this specific charge in their analyses. Quinn contextualizes it as a pocket crime.
A pocket crime.
Yeah, a highly elastic catch-all charge. Authorities utilize it when an action doesn't neatly fit into a strictly defined criminal statute, but they still really want to penalize the behavior. Basically a very ambiguous net.
And what actually got caught in that net is staggering. The case documents detail his digital activity over a 20-year period. 20 years. And he was using VPN software. He had an account with fewer than 100 followers.
A tiny account.
Tiny. Over 2 entire decades, he sporadically shared or retweeted less than 100 posts. We're talking about a digital ghost here.
Barely even a blip.
Right. And the content. The sources list academic debates on the CAP theorem in computer science, posts from the U.S. Embassy, a speech by Donald Trump criticizing communism, and some political art.
Like the Umbrella Girl.
Yes,
Yeah.
the Umbrella Girl from the Hong Kong protests, and a satirical cartoon featuring Xi Jinping and Donald Trump.
He was predominantly just clicking retweet on existing content. And some of that content had even circulated on major state media portals previously. But how the court interpreted his internal motivation, that is what drew intense scrutiny from the AI models.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources explicitly state the court used his high education level against him.
Which is wild.
It is. The prosecution argued that because he has a PhD, he possesses the cognitive ability to distinguish true from false. Therefore, he must have known these posts were false information, deliberately intended to cause social trouble.
Yeah.
That logic is baffling. It's like arguing a chef should instantly know if a farmer used the wrong fertilizer on a tomato simply because the chef went to culinary school.
DeepSeek's analysis thoroughly dismantles this logical leap. DeepSeek points out that the court basically transformed an educational background into a de facto presumption of guilt.
Wow.
Because in criminal law, you have to prove mens rea, the actual specific malicious intent of the defendant. But by substituting a stereotype about PhDs for empirical evidence of intent, the court entirely bypassed its burden of proof.
Because a doctorate in complex systems physics does not magically bestow the ability to instantly verify the geopolitical accuracy of a diplomatic tweet or a piece of satirical art.
Exactly. It makes no legal or logical sense.
That failure to establish intent seems like a massive procedural red flag. But looking at the AI analyses, the breakdown of the judicial process goes so much deeper than just the charges.
It really does. Gemini focuses extensively on the procedural violations of Article 14. The right to a fair trial, because this trial was held in secret. The presumption of innocence was entirely absent from the proceedings.
The prison blood letter actually contains a really visceral detail from the courtroom itself. When Dr. Chen attempted to defend himself using logic and network theory, the presiding judge allegedly yelled at him, "Shut up, answer yes or no."
And by demanding binary answers to incredibly complex systemic questions, the court actively stripped him of his fundamental right to mount a defense.
Right.
But the alleged violations extend way beyond the judge's bench. The case documents invoke Articles 7 and 9 of the ICCPR,
Yeah.
and they detail some severe physical and psychological abuses.
The allegations are just brutal. Police reportedly broke down his door without a warrant. He was subjected to 24-hour continuous interrogations. He alleges he was physically beaten to extract his digital passwords.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and denied basic survival necessities like food and access to a toilet.
And to compound the severity of all this, Quinn's analysis highlights a systemic violation of Article 26, the right to equality before the law. Quinn notes this glaring double standard. Dr. Chen was prosecuted and imprisoned for retweeting these specific texts and images, yet the original authors of the posts remained entirely untouched.
Wait, really?
Yes, even massive state media entities like CCTV that had historically shared identical news content faced zero legal repercussions.
So they only went after him.
Exactly. The enforcement of the law was surgically targeted at a single, isolated edge node in the network, and it ignored the major hubs entirely.
Okay, but let's look at this from the prosecution's side for a second, just to really test the boundaries of the law.
All right, let's do it.
If the prosecution's explicit claim is that these specific posts caused a serious disruption of public order, doesn't the legal system have an obligation to act? I mean, if someone yells fire in a crowded theater and causes a deadly stampede, that is a real disruption. The flaws in the trial process don't negate the panic in the theater.
And that is the pivotal challenge.
Yeah.
But what makes this case entirely unique is how Dr. Chen answered that exact argument. He didn't just rely on human rights appeals or procedural complaints. In his prison blood letter, he actually applied his life's work.
He used math.
Yes, he used complex systems physics to mathematically disprove the prosecution's legal claim of serious disorder.
Using physics to debunk a criminal charge, how does the math actually dismantle a legal argument about public order?
So he structures his defense by breaking the social network down into 3 distinct operational levels: micro, meso, and macro.
Okay.
At the micro level, which is basically the immediate blast radius of his actions, he applied something called the Galton-Watson branching process.
What does that measure in a digital space?
Well, the Golden-Watson process is a mathematical model traditionally used to calculate whether a family lineage will survive or go extinct based on reproductive rates.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so in network theory, it calculates the average branching number of an information chain. Basically, if you post something, how many secondary nodes propagate it.
Like how many people retweet your retweet?
Exactly. And because Dr. Chen had fewer than 100 followers and generated almost zero engagement, no likes, no comments, no secondary retweets, his branching factor was infinitesimally small. It was drastically less than 1.
Meaning the information chain structurally cannot sustain itself.
Right. The math is absolute here.
Yeah.
He proved his node existed in a deep subcritical zone. When a branching number is less than 1, the probability of the transmission chain going extinct is 100%.
Wow.
The mathematical reality is that his retweets were simply incapable of spreading.
But even if his personal blast radius is 0, we have to look at where he sits in the broader digital topology, right? What if he is connected to a highly volatile superspreader?
That is a great question, and that requires analyzing the meso level, the middle layer of the network's architecture. So for this, Dr. Chen applied Cohen's threshold for scale-free networks to determine his structural significance. Scale-free networks operate on a power law distribution. You have a tiny handful of supernodes with millions of connections like major news outlets or viral influencers. And then you have a massive, sprawling periphery of nodes with almost no connections.
And with under 100 followers, he's barely a speck on the periphery.
He defined himself as a long-tail edge node. And the physics of scale-free networks dictate a very specific resilience. Removing, altering, or activating an isolated long-tail edge node has zero structural impact on the global network.
None at all.
None. You could delete his entire digital history, or he could post 1,000 times a day, and the global flow of information remains entirely unchanged. He mathematically lacked the structural capacity to trigger a serious disruption.
Well, if he can't spread the information and his position in the network is structurally irrelevant, how did the prosecution attempt to blame him for a macro-level disruption of the entire social order?
They basically relied on poetic metaphors rather than empirical science.
Poetic metaphors.
Yeah. They invoked concepts like the butterfly effect, or being the straw that broke the camel's back, to establish a causality between his retweets and societal chaos.
That feels like a stretch.
Dr. Chen thought so too. He countered this using the macro-level physics concept of self-organized criticality, or SOC.
How does SOC explain network collapse?
The classic model for SOC is a growing sand pile. Imagine you drop sand onto a pile, just grain by grain. For a long time, the system easily absorbs the new information, the new grains of sand.
The pile just gets a little wider, a little taller.
Right. The structure adapts. But eventually, the pile reaches a critical, unstable state where dropping just one more grain triggers a massive, catastrophic avalanche.
And the state is arguing his retweet was that final, fatal grain of sand.
Exactly. But Dr. Chen points out that using the butterfly effect here is scientifically illiterate. The butterfly effect only works if a system is already in a supercritical, highly unstable state. If a massive social network collapses into an avalanche of chaos, SOC dictates that the collapse is an endogenous result of the entire system's structural fragility.
Meaning the problem is the pile itself?
Yes.
Yeah.
It means the system itself was already at a breaking point due to immense internal pressure. It is not the fault of a single edge node.
So what does this all mean? The prosecution is essentially blaming a single drop of rain for a massive concrete dam breaking. But they are completely ignoring that the dam was already structurally compromised from decades of internal pressure. And that specific drop of rain actually landed miles away in a tiny puddle.
That perfectly translates the physics. You simply cannot, mathematically or legally, hold an isolated drop of rain responsible for the systemic endogenous failure of a structure miles away. Yet, by substituting vague legal catch-alls for empirical proof of cause and effect, the court criminalized the puddle.
Which is insane.
The prosecution never proved the Chinese social network was in a supercritical state. And they certainly never proved his specific retweets possessed the kinetic energy to trigger an avalanche.
The journey through these sources is just wild. I mean, we start with the lofty global ideals of the ICCPR, the bouncer demanding clear rules and proportional responses.
Yeah.
Then we descend into the claustrophobic terror of a secret trial, where a judge demands a binary yes or no from a man trying to explain the shape of reality. And finally, we find clarity not in legal arguments, but in the elegant, unyielding mathematics of network physics.
What the sources show is that understanding the mechanics of complex systems is no longer just an academic pursuit for physicists. In an era of absolute information overload, understanding the empirical science of how information actually spreads is our strongest defense against arbitrary state power.
Absolutely.
When the law uses vague terms like disruption to criminalize the simple act of existing in a digital space, mathematics becomes the ultimate tool for accountability.
It really does. And it leaves you with a lingering, deeply unsettling thought as we wrap up this deep dive. Throughout the sources, the AI models and the case documents touch on the inherent limits of human systems, specifically referencing Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Oh, right.
The theorem proves that no complex logical system can ever be perfectly complete. There will always be blind spots, uncertainties, and unprovable truths. Human legal systems are fundamentally incomplete. They cannot possess absolute certainty.
And the demand for absolute certainty in an inherently complex, unpredictable world is exactly what leads a judge to yell "shut up" at a nuanced defense.
Exactly. So, if a human scholar with under 100 followers can be physically beaten and imprisoned because a rigid legal system demands binary certainty and automatically labels unapproved complexity as false, what happens to our society when those same rigid legal systems begin using AI algorithms?
That is the real question.
What happens when they deploy automated predictive models to preemptively punish disorder before a human even clicks retweet? If the system is already blind to the physics of reality, automating that blindness is terrifying.
It really is.
Something to think about the next time you leave a digital footprint. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious.